Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hello again. This is Multi-Hazards, a podcast where we take a deep dive into issues of emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And ultimately, it's about protecting communities. I'm your host, Vin Nelson. Season 1 is already 7 episodes deep after less than a month. COVID-19 is keeping me indoors and busy. Things are starting to open up in phases, but let us remember those who perished or suffered and continue to suffer. Now, on to today's topic. Again, we're privileged to have Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting Limited, and Program Director for the Security, Economics and Technology SET Hub at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute, PDI. He worked at CSIS, which is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the Communications Security Establishment, CSE, Canada's Signals Intelligence Agency, Senior Special Advisor in the National Security Directorate at Public Safety Canada, as consultant for the Ontario Provincial Police's Anti-Terrorism Section, PATS or PATS, and the Director of Security and Intelligence at the SecDev Group. He gives frequent presentations, has written some excellent books, writes articles for Ottawa's The Hill News and other Canadian and international media. He regularly blogs and podcasts on terrorism at his website www.borealisthreatandrisk.com and tweets at Borealis Saves. So, it's my custom here at the Multi-Hazards podcast, because of deep respect for the First Nations on whose land I podcast, here in the suburbs of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, to say a territorial acknowledgement. The text is from my neighboring Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU. Here it is. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. Now, just want to warn you ahead of time, sometimes the signal for our phone call between me and Phil Gurski, it cut in and out. So I've tried to edit some of this, but I wanted to keep the flow of the conversation, so I left some interruptions. So sorry in advance for this. So, without further ado, let's get to the interview. So here we are again at Multi-Hazards, and we have Phil Gurski again. Last time he enlightened us about so many things, and we're going to continue the conversation. So hi, Phil. It's great to hear from you again. Are you staying sane with all these COVID-19 recoveries and recent social conflicts all over the news?
It certainly has been an interesting time. I'll thank you, as is my family, and we are, in fact, looking at a whole bunch of things simultaneously. And I actually joked with somebody the other day that I was getting a little tired of COVID this and COVID that in my news feeds. And then what do I see? The race riots down in the United States, which spread to Canada and around the world. So sometimes you got to be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, it's like either one thing dominates the news or it's something else. So, yeah. So recapping from last time, we discussed 2 of the 6 major world religions in terms of the worst case scenario when religious adherents, they get involved in terrorism. We looked at Christianity, Islam, arguably the 2 biggest religions in the world. So now we have a few other religions that have millions and millions of believers worldwide. We have Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, etc. And those, you also discussed them in your book that was, you said last time, it was published at the end of 2019. It's called When Religion Kills, How Extremists Justify Violence Through Faith. And yeah, so Now, before we launch into the various religions, let's talk about the disclaimer we had from last time. We wanted to say right from the beginning that most people, including most religious people, are wonderful human beings. They're not plotting at night how they can bomb their neighbors. So I wonder if you could recap that for us, Phil.
Absolutely. I think that obviously when it comes to terrorism, when you hear a terrorist group that calls itself Islamic State, people jump to the conclusions that either Islam is inherently linked to terrorism or Muslims are inherently terrorists. And as you say, Vin, that's not the case at all. Out of the 1 billion Muslims in the world, very, very few resort to terrorism. Out of the 1.3 billion Christians, very, very few resort to terrorism. So whether or not you're religious, to recognize that religion is a wonderful source of inspiration and guidance for billions of people on earth, and that you don't want to make a one-to-one mapping good faith and a particular brand of violence, for the simple reason that the vast majority of people who are faithful do not engage in that. So you're right. I think we have to acknowledge that religion is a force for good for many, many people, and it is actually the exception, not the rule, when it is used to justify heinous acts of violence.
Right. And in your years with the, what was it, Canadian Secret Intelligence Service, CSIS, you basically were focusing on that less than 1% of the dark side, and most of it not even in Canada. It probably had Canadian connections, but it was happening a lot overseas. So you have a full career there behind you. I mean, you're still in it, right?
Yeah, so when I did work for Canadian Security Intelligence Service, my focus was on Islamist extremism. And as you say, it's true that a lot of what we were looking at did have international connections because people talk to each other, they send money, they send inspiration. And in a country like Canada, we are blessed in that the incidence of terrorism is very, very low. It's not to say it's not zero, but it certainly is of a much lower level of incidence than we see in many countries around the globe. We were looking at it for reasons that are completely germane to the CSIS Act and to the intelligence requirements leveraged by the government of Canada. But to clarify to your listeners, yes, from a professional perspective, my operational experience was tied pretty well exclusively to Islam and not the other forms of religious-based terrorism, which I discussed in my book, as you said, When Religion Kills, that was published by Lynn Reiner in late 2019.
Right. Oh, sorry, I didn't catch that word there. You said your focus was mostly on which religion?
Islamist extremists. So, Islamic State, Al Qaeda, Al Shabaab, and Canadians who subscribed to the same violent ideology that those terrorist groups basically spread around the world.
Right. We have to all remember that, especially with the internet and jet planes and immigration and people traveling, this globalized world has made it so that we can't just put a big bubble around Canada and make it airtight and just everything is outside and doesn't affect us. But when something happens overseas, there's a lot of connections. So that's why CSIS, Canadian Secret, is it Secret? Intelligence Services was involved in that.
Sure. Exactly. As a Canadian, I recognize that immigration is a force for good. I'm a third-generation immigrant from Eastern Europe. My grandparents emigrated to this country around the First World War. Anybody who knows what they're talking about will say that immigration is a good thing. It's good for your economy. It's good for your population. It's good for all kinds of things. Doesn't mean there aren't the odd bad apples that come in. And when I was with CSIS, we had a role to play in trying to identify people seeking to immigrate to Canada who we shouldn't let in because of their ties and because of their beliefs. But no, you're right. We don't live in a bubble. And from so many perspectives, we recognize that being connected to other countries around the world is definitely a good thing. And this current wave of populism you're seeing in certain countries, including our neighbor to the south, which seems to want to erect a fence or a wall around their country, is recognized by just about anybody serious as not a good move to make. So absolutely, we should be internationally connected. But as you say, that means that the terrorists are internationally connected as well.
Right. So instead of a wall, perhaps we just need a really secure filter. I'd like to bring up this wave theory. I was looking at your book, When Religion Kills, and you had a page. You were talking about this wave theory. You said it fascinated you, and the gist I got from it is that, as you said, few bad apples of a religion, they take those beliefs somehow, some way, and they justify using violence against perhaps their own co-religionists who they think are too moderate. They're not traveling that road that they go, or it could be on people who are outside the religion, non-believers. So I wonder if you could talk about the wave theory, and I don't even want to try to say the name of the person who wrote that, as you know how to say his family name.
Sure. So the wave theory of terrorism was developed in the early 2000s by a U.S. political scientist called David Rappaport, who I believe is out of UCLA in California. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Rappaport at a conference in Colorado in the early 2000s, or mid 2000s, and it was a thrill for me to meet this man because I've been reading his stuff. Essentially, what Dr. Rappaport was able to do, Vin, is look at terrorism going back to pretty well the early days, and most people would acknowledge that terrorism as a phenomenon really dates from the middle of the 19th century. Before that, we didn't call it terrorism, we called it something different. So modern terrorism dates from the middle of the 19th century. And what David was able to do was look at these grand, broad trends across the last century and a half. He divided the types of terrorism, so the motivations that were driving different terrorists and terrorist groups, into four what he called waves. So without going into a lot of detail, the first wave, which petered out around the end, and then what he called the anti-colonial wave, where a lot of countries were seeking independence, and some groups used violence to demand independence and put pressure on colonial powers. And that lasted until the better part of just after. Then he had what he called the socialist/new left wave. So think of groups like Red Army, Baader Meinhof Gang in Germany, Action Directe in France. And that kind of and then what he said that we entered about the 1979, and that's a very interesting year that we can talk about. There's three major events in 79 that launched what he called the religious wave of terrorism, and we are currently in that particular wave of terrorism and have been there for the better part of 40 years. And the interesting part about David's theory is that it lasts about 2 generations, so about 40 years. This particular religious terrorism is showing no signs of abating, even though it's reached the end of its life, according to his theory. So that's kind of where the wave theory goes. And so religious terrorism has been dominating terrorism since 1979, although there's still other forms of terrorism. We still have anarchist terrorism. We still have the Black Bloc, for example. We saw them here in Canada during the G20 riots in 2010. We still have ethno-nationalist terrorism. We still have left-wing terrorism. So it's not that the wave theory types of terrorism, it merely seeks to define and analyze the predominant motivations of what's driving terrorism at a given time in history. And that's why his theory, I think, works really, really well.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I missed the first one again. What started it all?
It was the anarchist wave, and there were a whole bunch of very high-profile assassinations carried out in Russia, in Italy, in France, and believe it or not, a U.S. president was assassinated by an anarchist. This is President McKinley in, I think it was 1906, in Buffalo, New York, by a person subscribing to anarchist ideology. And of course, we're now seeing with the riots in the United States, allegations that anarchists may be, in fact, be behind some of the violence that has ensued from the protests surrounding the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. So the anarchists didn't go away completely.
Right. And it could be left wing or right wing.
Absolutely. We normally associate anarchists, I think, the far right, and I'm not an anarchist specialist, but I think you're absolutely correct that on the political spectrum, there's a wide variety of actors that could partake in this particular brand of violence. Right. Called ideological or political violence.
Okay. Now, just repeating for the listeners who may or may not have listened to the last podcast with Phil Gurski, I'd like to go back. How can we define terrorism? I know there's the legal, especially in Canada, we have a legal definition, and then there's the sort of popular media definition. What if you can tell us that?
Yeah, that opens up a real can of words, Vin, because I think terrorism means different things to different people. Obviously, the root is terror. It's the people who cause fear, people who cause individuals to become afraid. But I the Canadian Criminal Code for a couple of reasons. One is I am Canadian. B, when I worked at CSIS, we were obviously the criminal code, and I think it's probably the best short definition out there. So it's a Canadian Criminal Code. Terrorism is an act that is motivated by one of political, ideological, or religious underpinnings, and serious injury or death, or serious disruption of public services, or things like that. So, if those listeners who are interested can go to section 83.01 of the Canadian Criminal Code. Just go to justice.ca. You can find all the legislation there. Look at section 83.01, and that's what defines terrorism, and that's the one that I use going forward. I normally associate it with a serious act which indicates or suggests against people, but you can have people, let's say, blowing up pipelines, which is not an act against a person, but is also which also constitutes terrorism under the Canadian Criminal Code because it's disrupting an essential public service.
Right. So I'm catching something new here that I never thought of before. So it's not actually doing violence or trying to kill somebody. It can also just be trying to strike terror in the hearts of people you don't like.
Well, again, that in the public's mind, I think that is what people associate terrorism with, but the law doesn't do that. There's nothing in the law that talks about terrorism. The law does use the word intimidate. One of the clauses of the criminal code does mention intimidation of the public. It doesn't say terrorize the public or frighten the public or make them not want to leave their houses. So you got to be very careful here in distinguishing between popular definitions and legal definitions. And besides, Vin, this may sound silly, but I would counter that sharks terrorize people. Snakes terrorize people.
Well, they're hungry.
Sharks or snakes are terrorists.
From their perspective, they're just looking for the next meal, and then from our perspective, they're terrorizing us. So, anyways, going back to the chapter 1 of When Religion Kills, I read somewhere there it said that you're not getting into the question: are these people true believers, really following their religion? Like, do their scriptures say, "Yes, go and kill"? Yes, sir, I will go and kill. Or they're misinterpreting it. No, that was actually metaphorical. They didn't really mean that. You're not getting into any of that. You're more looking at how are people using religious language, religious references to justify their violence. So I wonder if you could explain that.
Sure. So number one, I'm not a religious scholar. I'm not a specialist in religious studies. And when it came to my pledge of neutrality when it comes to whether or not this was truly a reflection of religion, let's just use a very simple example, Vin. If I were to throw out the word Christianity and ask you, what is normative Christianity? How would you answer that question? Are Roman Catholics normative Christians? Are the Protestant faith normative Christians? Are the Mormons normative Christian? Are fundamental evangelicals normative Christians? So even within Christianity, just to pick one religion out of many, you have a wide range of beliefs, you have a wide range of practice, you have a wide range of emphasis on what scriptures mean the most to them. So when it comes to saying what is normative and what is not normative, that's a real challenge. I don't want to weigh in on that. I just wanted to look at groups who use scripture, symbols, or any kind of other image when they're carrying out their acts of violence or calling for acts of violence, which demonstrated to me that they were using religion to basically say, this is why we're doing this. Now, again, I have most experience with Islamist extremists, and as I say to people who've often pushed back, oh, you're painting Islam as a terrorist group. Islamic State has nothing to do with Islam. And I said, I'm not painting Islam as terrorists, but if you can show me a single Islamic State statement in which they do not quote the Quran or a hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, within the first 2 lines, I will buy you dinner. The fact remains is that they do use religious symbology, they do use religious imagery and actual extractions from sacred religious texts to say this is why we're doing it. That's the only thing I was trying to get across in the book, is that I'm not speaking for the terrorists. I'm just saying here's what they're using, here's what they're telling us, I'm going to conclude that they see themselves as religious, whether or not everyone else sees them as normative, non-mainstream, whatever, or simply a-religious. I'm going by what they say, not what others say.
Right. And I mean, honestly, probably most Muslims worldwide, including in Canada, they would say those guys are grabbing our pure religion, our scriptures, and they're really taking it the wrong way. They're perverting it. That's probably what most Muslims argue.
And that's exactly what they do. They say this is not representative. This is not what the Quran means. This is not what the Hadith mean. This is not what our faith calls upon us to do. And they do reject it. But you can't deny that there is an element of religion there. Because these are legitimate. These are real extractions from those sacred texts. They're not making this stuff. They're taking it from somewhere. I'm just saying that I'm not suggesting these people are representative. I'm just saying in their minds they see themselves as representative, and that's especially true for jihadis who reject and disagrees with, I would say, non-normative interpretation of Islam. And what that means is that they think God gives them the right, and not just the right. It gets worse than that. The obligation to kill people who disagree with their interpretation of Islam.
Right. And I didn't put this in the official questions, but I just wanted to ask this on the side. I think 9/11, just wait, it's getting a long time ago. When was 9/11 again? It was in 2000 and, sorry, Phil, do you remember?
Yeah, 2001, almost 20 years ago.
Okay, so 20 years ago. Now, I remember, because I'm old, I remember that the problem during 9/11 and after that is that on the other side, authorities were not distinguishing all the time, like who is just a normal Muslim and who is like thinking about terrorism. So it was the problem on our side, would say non-Muslims, that kind of mistreated everybody, painting everybody with the same brush. So hopefully in the last 20 years, authorities worldwide have learned something, the way they treat Muslims. That's what I'm saying. And the public too.
I would push back there, Vin. There's no question that in the aftermath of 9/11, a lot of people who couldn't spell Islam, who never had anything to do with Islam, were identifying mainstream normal people as part and parcel of this plot to kill. Meaning they associated Canadian Muslims with the 19 hijackers. And we saw hate attacks. We saw vindictive attacks against Muslims by average citizens. From the security perspective, I can tell you that that's not what we did. We certainly narrowed our focus to those who were advocating violence or those who were open to the possibility of using violence. We didn't target average Muslims. We didn't throw a blanket around the more than 1 million Canadian Muslims. We focused very, very narrowly on those on whom we had intelligence that were open to the possibilities. And we're allowed to do that under our mandate, under the CSIS Act. And we did that for a couple of reasons. First of all, we didn't believe that all Muslims were terrorists. We didn't believe we had to investigate all Muslims. And secondly, we didn't have the resources to do it. You can't investigate 1 million people. You simply don't have the horses to do that. So we had to identify those that really were potentially going to carry off an act of terrorism. And that's the people that we focused on. They're the ones that we investigated. We did not cast a wider net because it would have been impossible and frankly, probably unethical. And I defend that. I defend what my colleagues did to this day because I was part of it. I worked at CSIS on 9/11. I know exactly what happened that day and the feeling of my colleagues. And we definitely realized that we had to find the next guys who were going to do something analogous to 9/11, but not your average Muslim, either here in Canada or abroad. That's a miscategorization.
Right, and Muslim communities here, they were probably, they don't have the resources to weed out the bad apples from their midst. I'm not sure what their attitude toward the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service, CSIS, was, but if I were a Muslim, I'd be happy that somebody with the resources is getting rid of the bad apples and not ruining the reputation of every single Muslim.
Yeah, it was a bit hit and miss at first. There definitely was a state of denial in many communities. This has nothing to do with us. Why are you asking us these questions? And in fairness, I think there probably were some ham-handed efforts by some law enforcement and security services that didn't quite get it quite right at the beginning in terms of their liaison and outreach. But things got better over time. We ended up having a really good relationship with many communities across the country. There is no Muslim community across Canada. There are many Muslim communities because there's many municipalities and jurisdictions in this country. It got better with time. We learned about how to talk to each other. We knew how to express each other, our concerns, how to learn all this stuff. And so by the time I got to doing outreach with the Canadian government in the early 2010s, it was much, much better than it was in the aftermath of 9/11. People simply, we learned from our mistake on both sides. And, and therefore we had a good dialogue so we could talk about these things.
Right, exactly. Now, I read in your book the word blasphemy. And when I hear that word, I think about, there was a person in South Asia who dropped the religion, became an atheist, and then blogged, and then the people of the nation, some people got angry and said, you're blaspheming. And then in another country, I think there was a woman who deconverted from the majority religion. She became another religion, and then they accused her of blasphemy. So I'm just wondering, what is blasphemy, and how can this be an excuse for religious violence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I said earlier, I'm not a scholar of religion, but my understanding of blasphemy is that you're saying something which a religion forbids you from saying. And for a lot of, very fun, argue verging on extremists, not necessarily violent extremists, but extremist interpretations of some faiths, this is a serious offense. You are seen as insulting God, insulting religion, and you must be punished for that. Look, Finn, I'm older than you. I remember the days where there's certain things you couldn't say in school. You couldn't say, you had to say darn it. You couldn't say because that was perceived as using language that would be offensive. So different people have different views on what constitutes an offense or not. And amongst the more extremist communities, not only do they have a rather wide swath of offenses that would fit under this rubric, they also have very serious penalties, up to including death, for those who blaspheme, those who say things they shouldn't. So I think it varies across the scale. I don't know if I'm going to offend anybody here, but one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. I'm a real Monty Python fan. I've been a Monty Python fan since 1960.
Yeah, I remember those.
And if you haven't seen Monty Python's Life of Brian, which, by the way, when it came out in 1979, I was just in first year university. There were Christian groups who accused Monty Python of blasphemy because they made fun of religion. And there's this great scene where John Cleese plays a rabbi who is seeking to stone this old man to death because he said something to his wife about Jehovah. It's a hilarious scene because it pokes fun of some of the seriousness. But, again, without trying to be offensive, for some people, this is a serious. We have to recognize their sensitivities without going to the same degree where we're saying sensitivities to the point where I authorize you to kill someone because you feel they have blasphemed or insulted your deity. In 21st century Canada, we don't do that, right? But we did 600 years ago in Christendom. People were burned at the stake for blasphemy. So it's a complicated topic,
right.
But there certainly are groups, out Indonesia as one, Islamic State would regularly execute people for what it called blasphemy. So it did still go on in the 21st century.
Right. So, and I know that, sorry to not complete this discussion topic too early, but I just have one more idea that it's, in a way, you can't also throw gasoline on fire, right? Like, that people they love the religion, they love the founders or whoever, and maybe there is a point where you can talk to people and you can talk about their ethics, you can talk about some of their beliefs as it relates to the rest of the community. But when you directly go and mock somebody's founder or mock somebody's religious practice, that it's kind of like you're inciting something.
Yeah, Mike, I want to pick up on that just quickly before I move on, Vin. I don't disagree with you from good citizen, good neighbor perspective. You shouldn't go out of your way to insult people anyway at the best of times. But what do you do with satire? Look at the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France in 2015, 2016. Here's a magazine that shows, it's a satirical magazine. It chose to put out some articles that satirize certain aspects of Islam, and people died as a result. People were killed by Islamist extremists. You go to the States, under their First Amendment, you can say just about anything you want, short of inciting actual violence. And the Constitution protects you. This is why the United States doesn't have any blasphemy laws in the 21st century, because the Constitution protects freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So it's a very dicey road to go down. Again, I think as a human being, it's a good idea not to wantonly insult people just for fun. But we have freedom of expression and freedom of thought and freedom of religion, and that's a delicate sort of balance you have to play at any given time.
Right. So just one last thought here. One of my favorite movies from India was called PK. One of their major stars, Amir Khan, and basically the whole movie was him as an alien coming down to Earth and dealing with many different religions in the city that he had parachuted down to. So it was quite hilarious. And then it was funny. I think that even the people from the various religions in India, they were kind of happy. It wasn't mocking them, but it was just kind of poking holes and saying, putting a mirror up to society. So sometimes it can be a constructive thing, and sometimes it can be just like somebody going on Twitter and saying you're an idiot. But so moving on, let's talk about, we talked about two Abrahamic religions. So that's Christianity and Islam. And then, well, who was Abraham? So I think he was a prophet regarded by many people. And one of the religions that most identifies with the prophet Abraham was Judaism. And now there were some followers of Judaism who did drift over to the dark side. And I haven't heard much about that. I wonder if you can tell us about Judaism here.
Sure. Again, I'll keep giving this proviso, this warning. I'm not a religious scholar and I'm not an expert in Judaism, but you go back to the early days of the Roman occupation, around the time when Christ is alleged to have been born. There were Jewish terrorists back then fighting the Romans, right? They were called the Sicarii. Judaism is no different than any other religion. It has various interpretations, ranging from, and these are not accurate terms, liberal to conservative to fundamentalist to extremist. And there are definitely actors within the Jewish community in Israel today would qualify as extremists. And largely I'm talking about the ultra-Orthodox, the vast majority of whom are definitely not mainstream. Most Jews are not ultra-Orthodox, even in the state of Israel. They would be extreme from a belief perspective, and a very, very, very small number of the extreme ones are violently extreme. And we have seen attacks in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, by ultra-Orthodox extreme Jews against Palestinians. And, it's funny, Vin, you talk about what's happening during, we talked about COVID at the outset. What I have found fascinating in the last 3 months or so is how many people have used religion, and I would say an extreme interpretation of religion, to fight back against lockdowns and social isolation. I have a right to gather in number because God wants me to. The ultra-Orthodox are guilty of this. Certain mosques in the Asian Middle East are guilty of this. Imams saying you cannot prevent us from gathering for prayers. Certain Christian churches are guilty of this. We will still have mass amounts of people because either we don't believe in COVID or God's going to protect us from COVID or whatever. So yeah, there definitely are elements within modern Judaism that go beyond extremism and extremism. And I do talk about some of the attacks in the book. And Yitzhak Rabin was killed by a Jewish extremist in 1994, I believe it was, or 96. Mm-hmm. Somebody who subscribed to these intemperate, very fundamentalist, very extreme views. And the reason Rabin was assassinated by a terrorist is because some religious leader said his blood is legitimate because he's selling Israel down the road by making peace with the Palestinians. If that's not a terrorist attack, I don't know what is. And if it's not a religious terrorist attack, I don't know what it is either.
Right. And I was reading somewhere, I took a course at Simon Fraser University near my home here in Vancouver on the history of the Middle East. And they were talking about that Zionists, I believe there was Zionist movements in UK, US, different countries where the diaspora Jews lived. And they wanted to see a new state founded. And these people subscribed to what they called Zionism. So there was, apart from say democratic pushes to see their dream realized, there were people who engaged in terrorism. So that was, I'm thinking, what, 100 years ago, or
Oh, not that far back. During the British mandate in Palestine, so before the creation of Israel in 1948, the British were in charge, and it was part of their, last vestiges of their empire. And there were attacks by Jewish extremists, including future Prime Minister Menachem Begin was a terrorist for what group called the Irgun, which was a Zionist extremist organization. There was a famous attack at, I think it was the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. I'm thinking 1937, around that time frame. There's no question that the vast majority of Zionists were political activists who wanted to see the creation of a Jewish state, sort of further to the Balfour Declaration in the UK during World War I. But there was a small fringe that used violence, and they were religiously / politically inspired. So, yeah, they were terrorists, absolutely. It doesn't go back as far as a century. It goes back to the 1930s.
right? Okay. Now, there's something that's been bothering me for years and years and years. And I'm wondering, like, why are Jews so much the target of hatred by many groups? Now, I read some history of Germany and other European countries. They said that Jewish people had settled there along the rivers of some in Germany. But they've had Roma, who was a minority in Europe and looked different than most Europeans for many, many centuries. So why aren't they singling out the Roma and saying, oh, there's a world conspiracy and you're going to take over the world? Like, so why are Jews singled out so much by the haters from not just one kind of hater? There's all kinds of creeds and stripes who hate on Jews. And it just boggles my mind, like, why this happens.
Yeah, I think there's a couple elements there. First of all, the Roma are targeted, especially by the far right white supremacists, because the Roma are seen as infiltrators. They're seen as foreign. They're seen as the undesirable. So there's certainly a lot of violence against Roma in many parts of Central and Western Europe by far right groups. As far as anti-Semitism concerned, I'm just going to weigh in with some thoughts. And again, this is not something I focused on, but if you think about it, when things go wrong, people want a scapegoat. They want someone to point to and say, it's your fault. Like we're seeing right now with COVID, right? I mean, you're in BC, and I mean, I've talked to Vancouver police recently, and there is a spike in hate crimes against Asians or those that look Asian. Why? Because they're associating China with the COVID virus, and therefore they're associating you as a person that looks like they may be Chinese with spreading the COVID virus. So people always want to point the finger somewhere. I think when it comes to anti-Semitism, this may also be true because for centuries, many Jews in the diaspora, the term that you used, were heavily involved in local economies. They were moneylenders, they were merchants, they were tradesmen, etc. And when things start going south economically, so you're not doing so well, and there have been recessions and depressions, through. This isn't just a modern phenomenon. People want to say it's your fault why I lost my job. It's your fault why I can't feed my children. It's your fault that the famine has come. It's your fault that the plague has come. And unfortunately, I think people of the Jewish community, because they were so closely associated with that, many parts of the economy, they were the ones on whom the blame actually settled.
I think I remember reading some history. Is it the Rothschild family? So this is a Jewish family, and they lived in London, UK. I think the father sent some sons out to a major city in Germany and in Paris, France, and they were doing business. And I'm not sure if this is historically accurate, but they were actually bankrolling Napoleon. So I don't know if that's the case, if some key Jewish families were involved in like very high stakes political maneuvers, then yeah, maybe they would become a target.
Yeah,
because they were involved. They were today, like right? They were involved in some major European events. So, yeah, I guess over time that builds up into a kind of a scapegoat magnet.
Absolutely. And as I was saying, George Soros is getting the same treatment today. George Soros is seen as this Jewish cabal, this power behind the throne that's dictating international events. And then you go down to the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, and you're imagining these things are happening. But and I think probably whatever the roots of anti-Semitism are, and I don't have any view on that. What you're building on is that today's anti-Semites, this has been going on for the better part of 2,000 years, so they don't know the history either. They're just jumping on the bandwagon because somebody told me in a YouTube video or on a podcast or on 4chan or 8chan or Reddit, whatever, this person whom I'm following, and I happen to respect his extremist views, he tells me the Jews are behind everything. He must be right. Why would he lie to me? So people just, they assume that these leaders are telling them the truth, and then they basically say they repeat the same things back. So these aren't necessarily the sharpest pencils in the box, Vin. These are people that simply are
no research.
They believe what. No, not at all. Not at all.
No. Okay. So now turning to Buddhism, like I had for many years an image of Buddhism as this peaceful religion that teaches meditation. And now you did a chapter on Buddhists involved in religious violence. So I'm wondering, like, how did this happen? Who was their main target?
I had a real hard time with this chapter for the very reasons that you mentioned. I don't know a lot about Buddhism, but I'm pretty sure that the term Buddhist terrorism should be an oxymoron, right? This should not make any sense to anybody because Buddhism, if anything, is associated with peace and spirituality, meditation and stuff. What I noticed in my research, though, Vin, was that there are 3 countries where there definitely is Buddhist extremism going on. And those 3 are Myanmar, also known as Burma, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. And for the sake of brevity, I'll simply focus on Myanmar. So you may have followed the news the last couple of years. There is Myanmar is an incredibly complex country. I think there are 56 recognized ethnicities in Myanmar. The Burmese, hence Burma, are the majority, but there's another 55 out there. One minority that's not recognized are the Rohingya. And the Rohingya live in the northwest. They are predominantly Muslim, and the current government, which is a military-led government, says you guys are interlopers. You don't belong here. You are recent immigrants from Bangladesh, which is right next door in the northwest. We don't want you to go home. And so there have been massacres by the army against the Rohingya over the past couple of years. And you've probably seen the news about, people fleeing in boats, and there's massive internally displaced camps in Bangladesh, etc. And a lot of this violence was actually led by a Buddhist monk, and I don't speak Burmese, so I'm going to butcher his name, but he goes by the name Uratu, and his nickname is the Buddhist Bin Laden.
Wow.
And in my book, I came up with dozens of quotes by this well-respected, venerated Buddhist scholar, Buddhist monk, who justified killing the Rohingya, justified killing Muslims. So again, going back to how we started this podcast, I'm not saying that what he preaches is normative Buddhism. I'm just saying he's a Buddhist monk with a large following, and he's using his position of being a venerated leader to justify acts of violence. Ergo, that's religious terrorism to me. And that was the classic example. Like, I couldn't get over some of the things that he said about these Muslims in northwest Myanmar. And last count, there's about 1 million of them living in those camps in Bangladesh. I don't know how many have been slaughtered, and the violence is still continuing. Now, the problem is there are also Muslim terrorist groups seeking to hit the Burmese army to protect the Rohingya Muslims. So are they terrorists? Are they freedom fighters? That's a whole other debate. I don't know if I want to have right now, man.
Right.
One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter.
Gets complicated there. So, yeah, I've met some Rohingya people. I hope I'm pronouncing that. I heard somebody in a podcast say Rohingya, but anyways, I've met some people from there, and I've met also some Karen minority people. I think they live closer to the Thai border, and majority evangelical Christian, and they've been targeted. They've been in refugee camps in Thailand for many years because of that. So just moving over to India, which is second largest population country in the world. I believe it's around 1.1 billion, and their majority religion is Hinduism. So I haven't heard too much about Hindu people, Hindu believers being engaged in terrorist act, but I think you looked into that, you researched that.
a lot. And again, I'll point back to it's not just a recent phenomenon. Mahatma Gandhi, one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century, a Hindu extremist. So what has happened in India, again, not only recently, but especially recently, is you've had a party called the BJP, I think called the Bharatiya Janata Party, which sponsors or is sponsored by, is very close to an organization called the RSS, and I don't remember offhand what it stands for. This is a Hindu extremist organization that believes that India is for Hindus and Hindus alone. Now, quick history lesson. India used to be part of the Mughal Empire until the British came around in the late 18th century. It was about 20% of Indians are Muslims. Hindu extremists want to erase that part of their history. They want the Muslims to leave because they see India as purely a Hindu nation. And they have carried out heinous acts of violence against Muslims. They accuse Muslims of being involved in the cattle slaughter industry. Of course, for Hindus, cattle are sacred. So they blame Muslims for killing cows, and they will lynch people for doing that. They also blame Muslim men for forcibly converting Hindu women to Islam so they can marry them. They call that love jihad. That's the actual term they use. Okay. And they have lynched men and women for doing so. The biggest problem now, Vin, is that the current leader, the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is heavily tied to the RSS. He himself is a Hindu extremist, but a lot of the policies of his government have been very much to appease the RSS and the extremists within it. And it's funny, whenever I talk about Hindu extremism in my podcasts and blogs, I get feedback from Hindu extremists saying, I have no idea what I'm talking about. You know, it's not extremism, it's who we are. So it has caused a lot of rancor, but there's no question that there have been acts of violence carried out by Hindu extremists who, now some would argue it's more ethno-nationalist, but religious terminology is being used, religious justification is being used, and that goes back to why I wrote the book in the first place. I'm not saying this is normative. I'm not saying this is representative, but you cannot deny there's a religious aspect to it. So yeah, India is a place to watch, definitely, and Modi is very popular right now. So if he maintains power indefinitely, you're going to see a rise in attacks.
Right. It's kind of strange though, because I know it makes people and leaders in Pakistan really angry, but then on the other side you've got Bangladesh, which is majority Muslim, and as far as I know they're trying to keep a good relationship with India. So it seems like Hindu extremism wouldn't really make your neighbors that happy. So it's not really good for regional peace. No,
but you know, we have to be fair, right? I mean, Pakistan sent Islamist extremists into India. Think of the attack back in, was it 2008, 2009, the major attack on the hotel, the Taj Mahal Palace, I believe it was, in India, where hundreds died. So yeah, Pakistan is also trying to undermine Indian security. And then there's the whole Kashmir issue, which Pakistan and India are arguing over. It's half Muslim, half Hindu. So no, I'm not absolving the Pakistanis of, you know, they are definitely fomenting violence as well. But I'm just saying that within India, the Modi government is instituting policies that are unhelpful at a minimum and resulting in the deaths of people at a maximum.
Right. Now, one of the states in India, and I believe, I'm not sure, 80 million people, is called Punjab. And as far as I know, it's like the breadbasket of India. This is where a lot of the agricultural products are made and distributed throughout India. And their majority religion there, the people who are kind of stuck between Pakistan and the Muslims on one side, their border on it, and then on the other side, there are Hindus all over that area of northern India, but it's the Sikhs. Now, I live in a place outside of Vancouver, and I could probably safely say at least 30% of the people here in our city are Punjabi Sikhs. And most of them come from Punjab. Some of them are coming from Delhi. As far as I know, Delhi, the capital, has a lot of Sikhs. Some of them come from UK, Australia, Philippines, America, and they migrate here. And as far as I know, near you, Phil, there's a big community over in Mississauga, Ontario. So I remember years ago when I was younger, I felt intimidated. I'd see men wearing turbans. I'd see the long flowing beards. Once in a while, you'd see the ceremonial dagger, and I just felt nervous right? People could say, well, you're a white Norwegian Canadian, it's racism, but it was something different for me. It was something new. You see the women walking down the street with head coverings, flowing saris. And then around, I don't know, it was 6 years ago, I read a couple books on Sikhism. I watched a bunch of Punjabi movies. I went to their temples, and then I felt a whole lot better, because my conclusion was, these are nice people. They're industrious, they're savvy, they're well adapted to Canada. They're kind neighbors. You might smell some curry wafting down the street as you're walking, but you know what? I love curry. I love their food. So I'm just wondering, how did a very small percentage of Sikh followers get involved in religious violence?
Yeah, this is where we're going to have to be as fair as we can, because this type of terrorism, which, as you know, I have an entire chapter on Sikh terrorism in my book as well. I have to acknowledge that this form of terror is the border between ethno-nationalist and religious, and a lot of Sikhs, at least in the modern sense, to the early 1980s, when there was a group of Sikh extremists who occupied a place called the Golden Temple in Amritsar, and Indian intelligence and the military got some information that they were basically gathering arms, stockpiling arms. And there was a fear that they were going to lead some kind of an insurrection, whether it's to, develop a freedom for Punjab. You hear a lot about Khalistan, and they wanted an independent Khalistan, which would have been in Punjab province. There were people that were advocating for independence for this part of India, and those were advocating it violently, i.e., at the end of a rifle. Okay.
Right.
They're going to achieve this kind of thing. So in '84, the Indian Army marched in and essentially evicted these extremists from the Golden Temple, and a lot of people died. Right. And in the sort of, as a result of that, Indira Gandhi was assassinated a few months later by two of her bodyguards who happened to be Sikh. And then, of course, from a Canadian perspective, and more importantly from where you are, Vin, on the West Coast, we had the Air India bombing in June of 1985, which was planned, executed, and carried out by Sikh terrorists living in Vancouver in the Lower Mainland. That, of course, went down off the coast of Ireland on the way to Heathrow, killing 325 people. And what people forget, we're living in this 9/11, post 9/11 period. That act of terrorism was the single greatest act of terrorism in the history of terrorism prior to 9/11. And it was planned by Sikh extremists living in Canada. So it is serious. And it seems to have dissipated a little bit, but no one should be under any false illusion that there's no such thing as Sikh extremism anymore. But again, is it ethno-nationalist or is it religious? And I think in this case, we struggle with, well, what does it mean to be Sikh? What does it mean to have a Sikh identity? Is that a religious identity? Is that an ethno-nationalist identity? I don't have an answer, but to me, there were definitely religious scholars and religious leaders who were behind some of the violence in terms of instigating or fomenting it. That's why I call that religious terrorism as well. But it's a muddied water kind of thing, and I think that there's room for debate on what you actually question that Sikh extremists have carried out heinous acts of violence.
Right. And when I was studying some Sikh history, it seemed that in the first few decades, I'm not sure if you could say centuries, it's a pretty young religion. It's only say 500 years old. But in the first few years, there wasn't any kind of militarism. But then there was a generation where a new guru came, and then all of a sudden said, we're kind of stuck here between Muslims on one side, Hindus on the other, and we've got our own religion happening here, and we need to carry weapons and protect ourselves better. So it kind of had a little bit of a militaristic veneer, and people carrying daggers. And then many Sikhs later on joined the Indian Army. They joined police forces. They were security guards. So a lot of people say that there is this kind of militaristic image that comes forth from the religion, beyond what they say about peace too. There's also that coming out.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are turned off by the outward, the kirpan, the dagger that they wear. I think people make mental association between observant Sikhs and militancy. And I think there's a prejudice there. I'm neutral. I don't I don't care what your faith teaches you in terms of what you must wear, what you must carry. But I think that for most people living in the Lower Mainland or Mississauga or in Ottawa where I am, seeing someone walk down the street with a knife is kind of scary, right? And there was even a case in Quebec a few years ago where a young Sikh student was asked by the school board to take his knife off, and he said, "I can't. That's one of there's 5 pillars, I think, to the Sikh faith. I forgot what the other 4 are." And he said, "That's freedom of religion." And I think it went all the way into the Supreme Court of Quebec. And I don't remember the result right now, but there's no question that for some people, seeing a 17-year-old boy, young man, in a school with a knife, it's a little bit off-putting, right? Whether it's for religious purposes or not. No one wants to see a knife in a high school. So
it's not like a dollar store dagger with made of plastic. It's a real thing.
Absolutely, and I don't think it's used to carry out acts of violence by Sikhs, but it could. It push came to shove. But yeah, it's not a dollar store knife. It's an actual dagger that could do some serious damage.
Right. Well, so just kind of coming back, I love Sikhs. I love Punjabi people. They're my neighbors. So I'm so glad that any of this kind of what you call extremism, I'm glad it's just very, very small in the communities here. And even in recent years, you really haven't heard much. And of course, there's conflict between Hindus and the government in India and the Muslims and the Sikhs. But over here in Canada, yeah, it's reflected here a little bit, but we don't really see any of that conflict playing out on our streets, which is lucky for us, I guess.
Yeah, so, just quickly, Ben. Haven't seen the level of violence we saw back in Air India. There was an attempted assassination of a BC politician. There was an attempted assassination for visiting Indian official in the mid-1980s. The point is that terrorism is all about grievance. Terrorism is all about something to do. And the fact that Khalistan is not independent, the fact that they don't have their homeland, could potentially lead some people on the fringes of Sikh society to resort once again to violence to get their way, because that accomplishment has not been achieved. I'm not saying it's going to. I'm just saying that the grievance is still outstanding. And when grievances are outstanding, sometimes people take the law into their own hands. I think it's important to remember that.
Right. Now, are there any other smaller religions or sects that are notable in terms of terrorism?
Not to the best of my knowledge. There may be the odd one. The ones I covered in the book were the big 6. So Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, Sikhism, and what am I forgetting here? Anyway, the 6 that I talked about were the ones that seemed to be the ones that were most representative of acts of violence carried out in the name of religion. I can't think off the top of my head of any other minor one. You could look at maybe the Onshun Rikyo people up in Japan in the 1990s. They had elements of Buddhism, but also elements of Shinto. I know nothing about Shintoism, so I can't comment on that. Right. But it seems to me that no, I can't think of any other religion that engages in violence in the name of their god, deities, beliefs, or whatever.
Okay, so what about we could call anti-theists? I know there are people and groups out there who are, say, atheistic or agnostic, and they actually target religion. They mock them online, and they call them anti-theists. And has there ever come some violence or terrorism from these people?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer to it. You could probably say that some people within some aspects of the white supremacist movement are probably atheists. I'm thinking of those that are maybe more neo-Nazi in their ideology. I would associate more that with atheism, but I can be very careful here. I'm not a specialist in neo-Nazi ideology. That would probably be the closest example I could think of. I can't think of any group that is outwardly, proudly says we are atheists and we will kill anybody who believes in any god. I've never come across that before. Maybe some of your listeners might have examples, but not to my knowledge, no.
And then, some of the atheists associated with Marxism, probably, we could see that in Russia, Soviet Union. You could see that in say China before. Maybe I'm not sure about Vietnam or Cuba or any other communist country, but there have been some Marxist movements who associated with atheism, and they specifically targeted religious people. So it's kind of like the other end of the terrorist perspective, if you can call that terrorism.
Well, you would call it state-sponsored terrorism, which was a category and still is a category for some people. You don't see state-sponsored terrorism to the same extent you once did in the 60s and 70s, I would argue, but it certainly is out there. And I would argue that if you had a Marxist terrorist movement, it probably had state backing, either by the Soviets, as you said, or the Chinese or whatever. And that would be a very interesting sort of sideline of terrorism that appears for the time being to have kind of petered out for the most part.
Right. Now, Phil, I'm just wondering, are there any other important lessons here that you'd like to mention for our listeners?
A couple. Again, and we've repeated this ad nauseum. Calling somebody or somebodies a religious terrorist or religious terrorist group is in no way meant to construe that the religion itself condones terrorism or that it somehow is inherently bad. That would be a false conclusion to make, and one that far too many people have made, especially in the post 9/11 era. Secondly, religion obviously is very important for people. Many people, it's part of their identity. For some people, it is their identity, not just a part of it. And therefore, they can be convinced to carry out certain acts, including violence, because they are led to believe that their religion calls upon them to do certain things. This is what I think what you're seeing, especially with groups like Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, have basically told their adherents, demands this of you. You have to do this. This is what God wants you to do. So it shouldn't be surprising that we do, in fact, see what we would normally say as devout religious people engaging in acts of violence. And the thing is that it's complicated. I think identity is complicated. I mean, I think I wrote in one of my books, if you ask, I give you a variety of answers. I'm male. I'm turning 60 this year. I'm a father, a husband, a father-in-law, a grandfather. I'm a brother. I was at one point nominally Christian. I'm a former spy. I'm a really bad pickup goaltender in hockey. I mean, there's all kinds of things. I'm third generation Eastern European Canadian immigrant. There's all kinds of things that define me. And I think we must be really careful with saying that somebody is, in fact, yeah, they're X, but they're also Y and Z and Q and R and S and T and all kinds of other things. So when we use this label of extremism, we cannot ignore there are many factors involved in why you do this. It's not just your faith that's calling you to do this. There could be some other aspects. There could be personal elements. There could be political elements. There could be there could be relationship elements. There could be personality elements. There could be maybe in some cases psychological elements. We really, I think, very, very precise in our analysis to not try to reduce it to one thing or one thing alone. And I wasn't trying to do that with the book. And I made it quite clear that just because I call you a Sikh extremist, I'm not saying that the acts of violence carried out by that group were only motivated by the tenets of the Sikh religion. There are lots of other things that come in. And I think that's an important takeaway. Vin, I've always learned that most things are complicated. One of my favorite lines from all the movies I've seen is a line in the very last Harry Potter film where Harry's talking to the goblin about the sword of Gryffindor, and he asked the goblin a question, and the goblin's answer is, it's complicated. That to me defines life. Life is complicated. Everything's complicated. Nothing is black and white. And that goes for terrorist groups too. Right.
Well, in the U.S., they always say, thank you for your service to somebody who's been in the army or maybe the police force. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but I'd like to say that to you and to all the people who are working in the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, or other people who are anti-terrorist, because they're not picking on people. They're trying to weed out bad apples so that the community, the society, the nation, whatever, is safe, because We don't want to have to go to the supermarket and worry that there's going to be a bomb going off. We don't want to have to start our car, and worry that, there's going to be a bomb in the trunk that goes off. We want to be safe. And I want to thank you, Phil, and all the other people, all your colleagues, for keeping people safe. You're not there to pick on groups. You're there to keep the majority and even the minorities safe and secure. I think that's very, very valuable. People need to recognize that. That's in fact, this is kind of what you call part of emergency or disaster management, just keeping the population safe. So I want to thank you for those years of service. I don't know if I'm in a position to do that. And I also thank you for all the wisdom and the insights that you've given us here on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Vin. That's very, very kind of you. And you're right. CSIS is not perfect. The RCMP is not perfect. Law enforcement's not perfect. We certainly have been seeing that over the past couple of weeks with what happened to George Floyd, which was completely heinous and unacceptable. But you're right. We don't go to work in the morning thinking, who can we screw? We go into work in the morning thinking, who can we help? Who can we protect? We do the job to the best of our abilities. We're just average Canadians who've done what we have. But I'd like to hope that eventually we can get a better dialogue going so we can explain ourselves better. People can understand why we do what we're doing. Sometimes our methods put people off and they assume nefarious motives. They're not nefarious. There's reasons why we do it. But yeah, as I say to people, I was really fortunate to work in that field for 32 years. I had a job where, no exaggeration, with very few exceptions, I could not wait to get to work in the morning every single day because it was so exciting. Wow. And it was so meaningful and it made a difference. So thank you, Vin. That your comments mean a lot to me, and I do appreciate them.
Right. Thank you. All right. Thanks for being on the podcast, Multi-Hazards, today. And I hope our listeners, you got a lot out of this conversation. And thanks, Phil. You have a wonderful weekend.
You too, Vin. Thanks for having me on for a second time. And you know what? If there's still some outstanding questions, I'd be more than happy to join you for a third occasion.
Okay. And everybody, one more thing. Phil has a podcast himself. It's what's your website again?
So www.borealisthreatandrisk.com. So BOREALIS threatandrisk.com. All my podcasts and blogs, they're all there in one place, and you're more than and if you can subscribe to them as well, you get them free of charge to your inbox every day.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Phil. You have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
You too, Vin. Thanks.
There we are. That's the interview. Again, very informative. Phil Gurski is a fount of wisdom when it comes to religious terrorism. Not something we may encounter every day, except in movies or in the news, but it's a very important topic worldwide that rises and ebbs with the times. So, again, thanks to Phil for being a guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. A little disclaimer here I added to the end of each and every episode these days, and it is, this podcast is meant to be educational and doesn't try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that the host, that's me, or guests are part of. So, here, as I wrap up this episode, I thank each one of you, my listeners, for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.